building to this territory. I see lots of people that I recognize, whom I know, so I'm trying to calm my nerves and think of this as a talk between friends. Maybe the building will help with this need on this topic more than any other to be reflective and humble and less sure of myself than I would like to present. My talk is entitled Race, Space, and Prostitution. It's very difficult for me to speak about prostitution because I think it's one of those topics where you need a lot more humility than scholars are generally capable of. And I'm no exception. It's a topic also that is very frustrating because it seems that we've been going around and around on this issue in feminism for some time, and there's a sense of things not really changing, a great sense of urgency right now with more than 600 missing and murdered women. There's a sense that we have to get our act together about this, and I don't know any way to do that except to share with you my own journey around it and hope that together we can come to some place a little bit clearer. Let me give you in advance, it's a long talk. I've got to look at my watch. It's long because I have this terrific anxiety that I've got to spend the first half of it making an argument to you for why we should never think about prostitution as a form of work only. And once that brush is cleared away, I'd like to get to the really important part of it, which is why we ought to have an anti-colonial analysis of prostitution. So I don't know if I'll get there in the time. I'm going to try and start waving your hands if you're just getting really fed up with it. But let me tell you in advance what the points are for people who like to think, logically. It won't be so logical, so I'll just tell you in advance and you can make it more logical than I'm saying it. The first point that I really want to make is that we have to give up this paradigm of understanding prostitution as about work. The tenacious hold of liberal feminism has lasted too long, and we've got to figure out some way beyond this. The second point in the argument is that feminists have focused, Western feminists, have focused far too long on questions of agency, choice, and consent, contract. And while these preoccupations of Western feminism have come from good places, come from an impulse to understand ourselves as women as subjects, it also is connected to some really bad places, to liberalism, to capitalism, and so on. So I want to talk about this focus and how we could get rid of it. The main reason for wanting to get rid of this kind of discussion around agency, choice, and contract is that it completely elides, it doesn't have to, but it tends to completely elide what prostitution does rather than what it is. And to get to what prostitution does, we have to focus on the Johns, on the customers. And so this might mean that there's not that much time left to talk about the agency of the women. When we focus on the Johns, the men who buy the services of women in prostitution, we need to think about what kind of a subject is produced through prostitution, what races, what classes, what nations, and what states are produced through this activity. I won't get to all of that, but that's the trajectory that I feel we need to get to. My conclusion is that one way to kind of analytically begin to dig ourselves out, analytically and politically, is to think very concretely about spaces. And so I hope to give some indicator, not much more than an indicator of what that really means. And I absolutely must end this talk somewhere where it makes sense to understand what's been happening on the downtown east side, what happens on the Highway of Tears, which isn't about prostitution but is linked, what happens to the strolls, what in fact happens to Aboriginal women across this country. And I think I need to get there in the end. I wish that I could have started there. So let me start by being, I think it's still controversial, which is really sad that it is. But let me start by repeating what Teresa Ziauret said in Toronto about 2 weeks ago. She's the director for Latin American and Caribbean region of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and she gave a talk at the University of Toronto, the Dame Nita Barrow lecture. And she said very plainly, she said, prostitution is not a job, it's violence. As you can imagine, even in 2011 in Toronto, this led to a kind of a raucous, even a scuffle. Two young women got up and very loudly proclaimed their right to engage in prostitution, and they challenged the speaker about her statistic that 90% of the women in prostitution were pimped. Teresa responded by going even further than she had in her talk, and she suggested that a very prominent Latin American activist for the rights of sex trade workers was in fact pimping, because her efforts were mainly to make women more available to be prostituted. The end result of this was that the women walked out very loudly, protesting that Ziauret was not respecting women's agency. About 1 week later, I think it was just last week, I get my days mixed up with flying, but Judith Butler came to Toronto. She came for the boycott campaign to boycott Israeli institutions. But somewhere along the line, she was being interviewed in several different places, and the magazine Extra asked her about her views on prostitution. She was very, very careful and said that she didn't want to respond very specifically because she didn't know the Canadian situation, and I'm glad she said that. But nevertheless, she ventured the opinion that she was against what she called coerced sexuality, but in favor of women who enter sex work to make a living wage. She made the argument these women need protection. She ended her intervention by saying prostitution isn't the worst option for women. So I think Judith Butler's position is actually the majority position at the moment, and that position is really about making a distinction between forced and free prostitution. It's an emphasis on prostitution as sex work, which is undertaken by women because they are desperate, and it emphasizes that we need to protect prostitutes as workers. There is, underpinning all of this, a kind of eliding of the violence of prostitution. That's the argument that I would like to get to. For many people who take the work position, the problem of prostitution is a problem of the law. That's the analysis that they offer. For example, a very recent article, I think the most recent issue of Canadian Journal of Women and the Law, had an article by Josephine Savarese, who argued that sex workers are routinely disadvantaged in the criminal justice system. She drew on Lisa Sanchez and suggested that the paradigm for dealing with sex workers in the justice system is one resembling a state of exception, in that they're not really given full legal rights. The system assumes that they're violable and that prostitution is risky work. Ironically, she drew on my own work to make this argument, but then took it in a direction that I absolutely would not, by arguing that sex workers are not being acknowledged in the criminal justice system for their labor and for the pleasure that they bring. So they're not treated as legitimate workers. Instead, they're treated as degenerate, which my own work tried to map. And I'll talk about that later. So I want to suggest that the criminal justice system cannot really treat workers as legitimate workers because prostitution is not primarily about a service or about pleasure. And so there's quite a lot of difficulty in squeezing that into the paradigm. I was really struck by the third event that I attended. So the first was Teresa's Ioritz, where she challenged everybody about trafficking. The second was the Judith Butler interview. But the third was a conference in Winnipeg. This is the second year that they've had this conference, and the conference is called Dear John, It's Rape, Not a Date. And it involves primarily, as far as I could see, Aboriginal women and Aboriginal organizations. It's funded by a trust. At this conference, no one spent even 1 second on prostitution as work. There were several people in attendance and speaking at this conference who were formally engaged in prostitution, but absolutely no one said it was a form of work. Everyone said it was related to colonization. I was most moved by Jason Gould, the brother of a woman who was murdered last year in Winnipeg. He made the point very simply. He was a very young man, but his point was, and I'm going to quote him, nothing makes this okay. Not the contract, not the money, not even her choice to do it. Nothing makes it okay. And I thought, how has it come to be that feminists have nothing to say to Jason Gould? How did we get ourselves into this position where we have nothing to say to him? Where to the Aboriginal women in the room who had all worked in prostitution and whose lives were extraordinarily violent, we seem to have nothing to say if we want to draw on what feminists are writing in the academy. And that struck me as truly worrying situation. So I think it led me to the very simple conclusion that when we think of prostitution, Pretty Woman, you know, the movie with Julia Roberts, maybe it's too old now for that to be a frame of reference. Pretty Woman is not our paradigm. It can't be our paradigm when we undertake this analysis. Our paradigm has to be missing and murdered women. And from that paradigm, we can build everything else. So the truly depressing part of all of this is that feminists have been engaging in this kind of discussion for maybe 100 years. If you study the history of feminism, and that is truly depressing. But wherever you stand in this discussion, legal, to legalize or not to legalize, is it work, is it violence, or something in between, or is it both? Prostitution is a very consistent zone of violence. The statistics absolutely boggle the mind. And they make it, in my view, and I'm definitely presenting to you a very made-up mind on the issue, which I know is part of the arrogance that I'm trying to be humble, but my mind is made up on this. It makes it obscene to be striving to describe this phenomenon as work instead of carnage. The carnage itself is so excessive that we remain at a loss for words on how to explain it. Is this a war on women, as Andrea Dworkin said a long time ago? Talking like, what is this? Second wave feminism a long time ago. Is this genocide, as Andrea Smith alleges that it is for Aboriginal women? Is the very act of sex by contract violence? Are men buying the right to violate? What you call it and how you analyze it have implications for the strategies that you pursue in how to end it. So I can see no other way out of this impasse among feminists than to begin with the discussion, as I said in my introduction, of what prostitution does as opposed to what it is. So this is not a discussion about agency. The discussion of agency, to my mind, is simply beside the point, given the carnage. kind of moving out of this paradigm is to move beyond an analysis that is only about gender. So it is very typical to understand prostitution as something that is about what men do to women. And so the question that has to be asked, I think, right from the beginning, is what does prostitution do for women who are not prostitutes? How are the lives of middle-class women shaped by the existence of an area of the city where prostitution occurs, and where a group of women exist whose bodies absorb male violence? How is the white high-class call girl constituted by the existence of the Aboriginal woman working on the street? How are zones of prostitution in North America related to zones of sex tourism outside North America? To fail to ask these kinds of questions is to miss understanding prostitution as a project of rule. And so that's the direction that I would like to go in. And as I've also said, I hope to say that to offer the argument that if you pursue a spatial analysis, you can begin to answer some of those questions. Okay, so a spatial analysis really begins with the Johns, and I feel that I have to illustrate how it is that feminists get into a situation where they've forgotten about the Johns. So let me describe to you the way that this debate happens within feminism, and is still happening. In her book, Walking the Victorian Streets, Deborah Nord, who is a 20th century feminist, is writing about her disagreement with Flora Tristan, who was a 19th century French feminist. She was actually the illegitimate daughter of a Peruvian man and a French woman, so she was pretty socially marginalized for her day. Flora Tristan knew very well what it was to be an outsider, and she became a kind of roving feminist journalist, spending much of her time writing articles about groups of women who were socially marginalized. Nevertheless, when she gets to London and she starts trying to write about women and poverty, she encounters a lot of personal trouble describing prostitution. And Nord, who is her 20th century counterpart, can't understand this at all. So Tristan gets to London and she begins to argue in her pieces that primarily aristocratic and bourgeois men have produced this intolerable situation of women having to sell their bodies. And, you know, she gets, if you look at her prose, she gets excessive in it. You're doing some kind of analysis about it, because she can't get beyond the violence that she feels she's witnessing. She remembers, for example, that she witnessed how a prostitute was treated in one of the city's brothels. It was an orgy attended by several men. It involved a very beautiful Irish woman, and the men were forcing the woman to drink mixtures of vinegar and mustard and pepper. She was suffering convulsions. They were pouring wine all over her, and so on. So Flora Tristan describes all of this, and she is so bothered by what she's seeing that she breaks off her description to launch into, you know, the statistics about the extent of prostitution, the short lifespan of prostitutes, the horrors of child prostitution, and so on. Her 20th century counterpart is very deeply critical of her. Deborah Nord's position, which used to be and maybe still is the dominant feminist position, is that Tristan betrays an inability to identify with the prostitute. So what does she mean by identification? She means that Tristan ought to see the prostitute simply as an economically marginalized woman. And Tristan disappoints, because all she wants to talk about is the dying dog on the floor, which is how she feels the woman is being treated. And so for Nord, this is to commit a terrible crime. It is to indulge in maternal femininity. It is to deny women of all agency. It is to empty them of judgment. It is to render them passive. It is to not accept that prostitutes are moral beings. And as Nord puts it, what Tristan is really doing is shifting her attention repeatedly to the male villain who robs women of their choice and will. And if women could exercise any will at all, they would not sell their bodies. You see the difference here in the two positions. Flora Tristan can't forget the John. She can't forget the violence. And she doesn't take any time off to think about the prostitute herself. Deborah Nord, for her part, doesn't even see the John, doesn't see the violence, focuses only on the agency of the prostitute. Neither one of them actually thinks of this encounter in prostitution as involving anything more than the two genders. So they don't think, for example, Tristan knows that this has something to do with the making of elite males, and she does mention that, so she gets to class. She may or may not have known that the Irish in 19th century England were an intensely racialized group. Nord also neglects this, understanding this encounter is between genders, not races. If, as you know, Sandra Gilman has argued very powerfully, the body of the prostitute in the 19th century Europe was always racially configured because it was always understood as an encounter between two races. If this is the case, then how is prostitution always, regardless of who the bodies are, how is it always about race, class, gender, sexuality? That's the question. Now, why then have feminists of the 20th century chosen to focus almost exclusively on the question of agency? I think there are many reasons for this, and here I will try to be humble because I think some of the impetus for it probably came from places that I would respect but won't go into. But at least one of the places that the focus on agency came from, I would argue, is that it is a very class-bound and race-bound argument. That when you focus on agency in this context, you forget about relations between classes and between races. The theme of agency originates in an understanding of how white middle-class women are regulated in patriarchy. Middle-class respectability has depended on the idea that white women are guardians of morality who do not participate as social actors in the public sphere. If that is what you think the problem is, subversion for women regulated by such discourses can take the form of fleeing the role of moral guardian, rejecting it, refusing, and taking on the role of the autonomous actor, the autonomous man who can go anywhere and do anything. Women of color, poor women, racialized women of all groups are very unlikely to conceptualize subversion on these terms for the simple reason that they struggle for the right to be seen as having moral virtue. It is not presumed that they are the guardians of morality. What is presumed is that they are not, that they are available. And so when feminists make the argument that women engaging in prostitution are doing a rebellious thing or a subversive thing, this very much depends on the idea of transgression from one position, the position of the angel, to the position of the rebel. This makes no sense at all for racialized women. If you consider prostitution as transgressive in any way, there are two moves that have to occur. One is that a man's use of a woman's body in prostitution has to be considered merely the expression of a bodily need and the pursuit of sexual pleasure. So you have to believe that if you're going to buy the transgression argument. The second thing you have to believe is that the prostitute is selling a service and not a self. Those are the two you have to have in place before you can walk this road of agency. In walking the road of agency, feminists have often ended up with the conclusion that anyone who condemns prostitution, who wants to see an end to it, is simply being a Victorian prude. And that has been the argument forever and a day. So, sometimes this particular argument in feminism has had the ring of sort of rationality and truth to it. For example, feminists who write about third world women often argue, as Louise White did in her much-quoted study of prostitution in Nairobi, that African women saw prostitution as a reliable means of capital accumulation. Their earnings enabled the survival of their families. It enabled men who came to the cities to have their sexual needs met. What is the problem? White argues, like so many others, that it's only when prostitution becomes illegal that we find male control, which is actually not true at all. Anyway, so we would look at, in White's account, these women are sort of anti-colonial heroes because they're surviving a really bad situation in Nairobi. Sex tourism, she reminds us, is really about capital accumulation. If you actually want to see how this looks in terms of the states, and I'm not going to get to that argument, go and consult Anna Gathangelou's book, The Way in Which Peripheral States, small states, try to get themselves into the club with the big boys through migrant workers and through prostitution, fostering these things in this elaborate game of capital accumulation. As Anna Gathangelou argues, peripheral states wipe themselves through prostitution, but I don't have time to do that. So one way in which you can sort of live with yourself around the argument of agency is simply to point out how much money is involved and how many people can survive it. North American feminists have engaged in something a lot more obscene in my view, and that is to argue that prostitution is some sort of feminist whoring. And the argument here is all about transgression. So, you'll get anthology after anthology published by Routledge usually, where feminist scholars are arguing that sex work is really energizing, it should be celebrated, it's only bad for some. As Evelina Giove put it, and she is an activist working to end prostitution, as she put it, what that kind of argument does is say that some women, through luck, through lack of talent, through class origins, through racism, some women don't get it right. Other women get it right. They get to be transgressive and feminist whores, and some women just don't get it right. And that's really what that argument amounts to in the end. Because in the end, you have to do something about the violence. In your explanation, the violence is rather hard to ignore. You have to be willful to ignore the violence in prostitution. And so you'll find in these feminist collections, if you want the references, you can look them up in my article. There are very few pimps, there are very few beatings, there are very few murders, there are very few juveniles forced into prostitution, there are very few women trafficked across borders. Of course, many feminists try to, in the face of all the violence, say, okay, I agree with you when it comes to trafficking. I don't agree with you when it comes to Pretty Woman. Well, that forced free distinction is deeply problematic because it is underpinned by this racialized and class division. Who is trafficked? Who is forced? And who is free? Those are questions that you have to ask. It also relies on the notion that consent makes the violence permissible. And so the conceptual framework of consent blocks our vision, and we begin to see two parties who are engaging in a contract. I'll pay you $100, you give me sex, and that's what we see with consent. What is interesting to think about is the way in which we see see the violence in other contracts. For example, there are probably very few of you in this room who will not think it violent that youth in Latin America has to sell his cornea, you know, or his liver, right? We have films about all this, and most people have the reaction of, my God, that's terrible, that's violence, that's not a very good thing. We don't have the reaction, it's a contract, it's a great deal, which is unfortunately the reaction we have with prostitution, and that should make us think twice about it. When feminists have told stories about prostitution as work, as contract, as choice, the trump has always been the research. This is why an academic who's standing here talking to you cannot be entirely innocent about this. We're deeply complicit. Prostitute stories become the way to make your arguments stick. So you say that you have gone and interviewed 100 people and they've all told you they wanted to be in prostitution because they need to feed their families, and so done deal. Some of these interviews are even participant observation things. I have many former students in this room. You'll all recognize the lament that's coming. How come we can criticize positivism on everything except this? You know, because you go and ask people what they think, you don't then report back that is what they think. You try to do some analysis as to what language are they using, what concepts are they using, why are they telling this story. Margaret Baldwin has written very critically and persuasively of this reliance on prostitute stories that are so central to feminist accounts of prostitution. She notes that the stories that feminists seem to gather are overwhelmingly positive. And she points out that what the stories really pursue is a story about sameness. All our lives are like the lives of prostituted women. This is a bit like, you remember that old argument that marriage is like slavery? Wonderful argument if you're not the slave, because marriage is not like slavery if you're the slave. It's a totally different system that is quite a lot more violent. So Margaret Baldwin says that's what we do, feminist academics, around prostitute stories, is we pursue the story of sameness. And what this does is that it finds many prostitutes but very little prostitution. And as she points out, the dead, the deeply incoherent, and those presently living in conditions of grave danger are not participants in these stories. You know, at this conference that I went to, there were two academics from Victoria, Susan Strega and Janine Carrier, who did do more than 120 interviews with Aboriginal women in and they didn't hear this story of work. They heard a story of violence. So we need to really think about these stories that we're hearing and from whom. Which is not to say that one couldn't hear this story from an Aboriginal woman working in the downtown east side, but a little deconstruction and critical analysis, please. Prostitutes are often not admitted to those feminist services where stories of violence can be collected. So we need to think about who can speak and who cannot speak. Baldwin even reminds us that this kind of storytelling requires the ability to remember, to draw conclusions, to reflect. Who are we talking about here when there's a population of a disproportionately high population of drug users, of mental illness, and so on? To get away from contract and choice and positivism and prostitute stories, the place that we have to start is one that radical feminists actually in the 60s, some of them started there. Kathleen Barry, for example, pointed out very early on the problem of prostitution lies in the idea that a job as a sex object is acceptable in the first place. Barry identifies the sex that men buy in prostitution, to quote her, as the same sex they take in rape. Sex that is disembodied, enacted on the bodies of women, who for the men do not exist as human beings, and the men are always in control. Objectified sex, or the eroticized hierarchy, establishes women as things. This, I think, should be our first clue. prostitution produces the kind of aggressive man for whom dehumanization is the point of it all. I think you should pause and think about if any of you have seen the documentaries on the men of Enron, you know, the traders, and the men associated with the last financial crisis. There's a wonderful documentary that's coming to theaters now called Inside Job. You know, after they spent all day doing all of this trading that has gotten so many people into financial health, they're all using the services of prostitutes every night. I find that really interesting because that should be another little red flag about who are the masculine subjects that this is all about. That's, you know, we need to think about that, how people make themselves into particular subjects. We should also go back to Cynthia Enloe's early words. We need prostitution on military bases. Why? Because that's the kind of masculinity that you need to fight wars. The masculinity that is given to dehumanizing not just women. Kathleen Barry and others in that early feminist period, what seems like such a long time ago now, also reminded us that some women are protected. For example, U.S. women are protected when another class of women, Vietnamese women, Filipinos, other women, become the group of women that American men use in prostitution. Then some women don't have to do that. They don't get to be violated. They don't get to be dehumanized. And so that relationship is one to think about. Feminists also early on reminded us of the extent of childhood sexual abuse among prostitutes. Every single study has noted this. It's not as though we don't have this evidence. And as Evelina Giovi again reminds us that a contractual agreement, sex for money, does not erase these violent histories, these violent conditions, these contemporary realities. So ultimately, I think where this takes us is that we need to begin to do maps, gender maps. Where are all the women? The one on the bases, the one on the downtown east side, the ones in the suburbs, the ones at UBC in women's studies classes. Where are all the women? What is the relationship among all the women? We need to focus on the making of a man. How does this make a particular kind of man? And that kind of man is needed for what exactly? What kind of project of domination? I think those are questions that take us in the direction of the mapping of bodies and the mapping of spaces, asking questions about how these relations come to be. It's a mapping of bodies that many people are familiar with. Diane Roberts argues in her book, The Myth of Aunt Jemima, you know, we're very used to this in literature, for example, in Faulkner and other things. The middle-class white woman represented as asexual, spiritual, morally elevated, and angelic. Black women represented as dirt, passion, sexuality, and all the bodies in between. This is something that we're very used to, these gender maps. We need to ask, what do the gender maps look like for us here, now, in Vancouver? Law has a very particular role to play in sustaining prostitution that I also think is an area that has to be deconstructed and could be deconstructed, again, through taking a spatial approach. Spaces of prostitution have been theorized in law as anomalous zones. In these kinds of anomalous zones, law makes it possible for the departure from fundamental norms. Things can happen in spaces of prostitution that cannot happen anywhere else. Violence is authorized in those spaces in a way that is simply not authorized anywhere else. And this is why space has been so important to the regulation of prostitution. In a space of prostitution, a temporary abandonment of societal norms is what is enabled. Men can move into this space, do whatever they like, stop being nice, respectable, ordinary men, and then come out again. They leave unscathed, but they leave something behind. They leave a violated woman behind. There to how much we care. If it happens on the downtown east side, it's a different kind of death than if it happens on the UBC campus. At some level, you all know this. You in Vancouver have more reason to know this than most because of the murders that have gone for so long, not confronted. So, if instead of the choice coercion framework, we actually began to pull apart the structured and strategic boundaries of belonging and unbelonging, who is a citizen, who's not a citizen, who counts, who doesn't count. We ask what these patterns enable. Prostitution it enables the dominance I spoke about, but prostitution itself wouldn't be happening if in fact women were not displaced, homeless, and so on. Paradoxically, it is property and home that men secure by treating the bodies of displaced women as places where violence can occur with impunity. So, to sum up where I've ended up in this before I get to the anti-colonial, and I'm really running over time here. Okay. Violence is necessary to the process of objectification, but more than this, it's necessary to convince bourgeois males or anybody aspiring to that category of their own identities. That's where you really understand that you are a colonizer. Those of us not directly involved in this situation are connected to this violence because the violence that is directed at some of us enables others of us to live lives of lesser violence. So prostitution is always about racial, class, and male dominance, and it's always about violence. If we look at the securing of nation states in the late 20th century, as I referred to Anna Gatangelou's work, you would see that these kinds of spatial considerations, where you have spaces of prostitution, groups of women designated to have the kind of status you need for this is what enables these economies to work. And it enables them to work on a macro level as well as psychically, because it produces the kinds of subjects who make it work. There's a wonderful poem by Christos, which I will not recite for you, but I will tell you the ideas in it that pretty much sum this up. Pimps, Johns, and tricks are scum, idea number 1. Idea number 2, prostitutes can still make more money than many other women. Idea number 3, most prostitutes were molested as children. Prostitution is getting paid for a violence that was happening anyway. 4, the violence of prostitution is unrelenting. 5, if we wrecked the business of prostitution, the business on Bay Street would be wrecked too. 6, there's no work for anybody not Miss White. 7, you don't have the right to talk about prostitution unless you recognize the violence, the connections between it, your fathers, your brothers, and your own femaleness. As this poem, which is a very powerful poem, ends up, if you're thinking about some generals in South America that they have some torture, you don't want to hear about some Johns and what they did to me, Pat or Crystal. All I can say is I can't wear Tampax 20 years later. This is what must remain front and center with us. I wanted to quickly go through how law regulates spaces, but I don't have time for that. You know, the discussion in feminism is always about if we move prostitution inside, it would be safer. If we made it legal and kept zones for it, then it would be better. This is absolutely not borne out in the studies in Germany and in the Netherlands and so on. It doesn't change anything about the violence. The violence just keeps moving to a group of women who are outside of these realms. So let me get to this anti-colonial analysis. And I've got how much? About 5 minutes. Okay, this is terrible to get there. But if you take an anti-colonial analysis and you want to analyze spaces, the thing that you need to do more than anything is to start asking what brings a woman to a particular encounter. 10 minutes. What brings a woman to a particular encounter? What brings a man? to that ajan, to that encounter. And I really stress this, and I tried this in my article on Pamela George, which some of you know. When you set about analyzing prostitution, you have to think about the journeys that each side made. And those journeys are historical journeys, they're spatial, you can take a strictly geographical approach to understand that encounter as happening under what conditions, and therefore what we could do about it. When I analyzed the murder of Pamela George, who was an Aboriginal woman in Regina, who was murdered by two white college students, middle-class boys, as they were called in the court, boys. When I analyzed that, it didn't take a lot of work to actually see the journeys. What brought Pamela George to that encounter? Well, Pamela George was Soto. She came from the Soto Reserve. That's a reserve, like many reserves, that were profoundly impoverished during the cutbacks to housing in the 1960s. In any event, she was part of a very long history where Aboriginal women's bodies are bodies available for white men. Pamela George's reserve was flooded by the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act that permitted the flooding and the building of dams. It impoverished the reserve. It enriched white farmers. It created the situation where there had to be an outflow of people from the reserves to the city. You see, I'm speaking very geographically here. She's moving from one space to another, perfectly comprehensible reasons. But then let's think about the men. What are they moving from? They're moving from university. They had finished their exams that week. They wanted to let off steam. To let off steam for them meant going to the spaces where they could get Aboriginal women and do anything they wanted to them and get away with it. That's what it meant. And if you trace their spaces, you would see that there was no chance in any of their spaces, most certainly not in their university classrooms, where they would have learned that Aboriginal women are human beings too. So you could see their journeys bringing them together. When this case gets to trial and they're being tried, Pamela George is considered to belong to a risky space, a space where bad things happen, a space where violence routinely occurs. Her killers are presumed to be not of that space at all. They're from very respectable spaces. And so the court eventually concludes that it was understandable that this could have happened, and the violence against her is very minimized. When you look at the very specific details of these men's lives, you can come to no other conclusion than this is the activity through which they could understand themselves as white men, as colonizers who could go anywhere and be anything and do anything. And if you set about doing the gender maps that I propose that you do, it's very easy to find their girlfriends, their wives, their mothers. For instance, they had the practice of taking their girlfriends, bundling them under blankets, and taking them down to experience vicariously this very dangerous and exciting encounter with savages. Those are people's girlfriends. In my journeys across Canada in the last few years since working on violence against Aboriginal peoples, everywhere I go to give a talk, after the talk, people come up and share things, so maybe they share over dinner. Every town in this country, every city in this country where there are Aboriginal people, everybody knows these everyday practices of violence. It just depends, where do they talk about it? I went to Thunder Bay and I learned that nice middle-class teenagers, the sons and daughters of my university colleagues, have the practice of driving down to a stroll and throwing objects at Aboriginal people. If you hit one, you get to drive on. If you don't hit one, you have to go get it. These are the everyday games of Canada. This is what non-Aboriginal peoples learn and do. These are practices that are intensely about establishing who's a colonizer and who's not. These journeys cannot seem natural to us. We must unmap them. We must ask questions about how it comes to be. We must denaturalize all of this. When you're in the business of unmapping, you're asking about the relationship between identity and space. What is being imagined or projected onto specific spaces or specific bodies? What is being enacted on those bodies? These 19th century patterns that maybe some of us are convinced of, we need to think about whether or not they changed in the 20th century. Are they basically the same patterns that accompanied the original theft of land and dispossession? Do they require the same dehumanization? Does this dehumanization through practices of violence provide us as a society with a paradigm in which we're all involved? I'd like at this point to recall Helen Betty Osborne, who was not working in prostitution, who was a 16-year-old schoolgirl, brutally murdered in DePauw, Manitoba. DePauw, Manitoba knew about these murderers, and for 20 years no one said anything. We should not be in any doubt at all about the collective nature of this encounter and about the collective project that this violence secures. As justices of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry said, DePauw, Manitoba had a frontier-like atmosphere, operated like a white enclave. I would suggest that we could conclude that of any place in Canada when it comes to Aboriginal bodies. So it should not be any surprise at all that two young white men who wish to let off steam and assert their power and feel in control should find that the perfect way to do this is to find an Aboriginal woman's body, and this will solve everything. These practices of masculinity are sustained by mothers who wash the genes from the blood of the murderers as they did for the murderers of Pamela George, fathers who protect their sons, girlfriends, white girlfriends about whom the murderers worried because they might have infected them. This is all a web. This is a map. We are all related. We don't get to be outside of this in any way, shape, or form. When it comes to the downtown east side, there is considerable work on this, much better than any that I've been able to do, that makes it perfectly clear that things are allowed to happen in that zone that are not allowed to happen anywhere else. Dara Kalain made a very powerful argument around it being a containment zone. She also made the same sort of unmapping arguments that I made for Pamela George. 70% of the children in care in Vancouver are of Aboriginal descent. 70% of the street prostitutes working in the most dangerous parts of the city are Aboriginal. As Kalain concludes, men who seek out Aboriginal women working as prostitutes on the downtown east side are buying license to commit violence, to degrade, to demean, to mean women considered disposable by Johns and by the society as a whole. We should not get used to these spaces. So what in the end prevents us from being accountable for this violence? What prevents us from doing the kind of historicizing? What prevents us from looking it in the eye? What prevents us from allowing these stories of violence never to penetrate our consciousness? Well, I've spent most of the talk trying to persuade you that what prevents us are these explanations around it's just about buying sex, it's just about doing a job, it's just about agency. What also prevents, and that's a bit, I said to somebody the other day, that's a bit like saying that slavery was just about planting cotton. Well, it was, but a whole lot else was going on as well, and it's that else that's going on. So the other major thing that prevents us from being accountable is that we think we're done with colonialism. Few of us in this room, I would hope, would go so far as to think, as Michael Ignatieff or Stephen Harper, that it just didn't happen. Ignatieff said it was peaceful settlement, happened a long time ago. Harper said the residential schools are all closed. We said story, game over. I think that's one of the things that allows us not to do this. Let me end by saying, colonization also seems to happen, and those of us pursue it critically, we think it happened to the colonized, but not to the colonizer. So we don't spend any time thinking about the making of the colonizer and how that must go on. Let me end with the lines of Andrea Smith on this. The denigration of Aboriginal women, the practices of prostitution that I've been talking about, what does this violence do? It destroys a people. I would then add to that, it creates a colonizer, psychically and materially. And finally, it secures the rest of us. In different ways, but secure, it does anyway. When we think of these maps, think of these spaces, we should think about sexual violence, as Andrea Smith put it, as a tool by which certain peoples become inherently rapeable, and the land itself becomes inherently rapeable. So I think the message is that we must see violence in its historical context, its material context, and most of all as a continuum. And this is best achieved by asking what it does.